Back to the Future cast reveals what most fans never figured out. What if I told you that Marty McFly almost traveled through time inside a refrigerator, that Doc Brown almost said no to the role, and that the actress originally cast as Jennifer Parker was fired for a reason that had nothing to do with her acting? If you've watched Back to the Future 100 times, you probably think you know every secret this movie has to offer. But the story behind the story is stranger, messier, and more dramatic than anything that made it onto the screen. Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll never watch that DeLorean the same way again. Let's start with the time machine itself, because before it was a shiny silver sports car, it wasn't a car at all. When Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale first sat down to write the script, they imagined the time travel device as something bulky and stationary, closer to a machine you'd find in an old-school laboratory. Some early accounts of the writing process describe versions of the concept where the device was housed in a large box-like unit, something a character would have to climb inside and activate rather than drive. It had that classic mad scientist energy, the kind of contraption you'd expect to see humming away in the corner of a basement lab, full of dials and switches and dramatic sparks. On paper, it made a certain kind of sense. Science fiction had a long tradition of stationary machines, chambers, and pods that whisked characters through time without anyone ever needing to leave the room. But Zemeckis and Gale quickly realized that a stationary machine created a massive storytelling problem. If the time machine can't move, then every dramatic moment in the story has to happen in one place. Think about how many iconic scenes in the finished film depend on movement. The race against the clock tower, the chase through the streets of Hill Valley, the moment the DeLorean vanishes in a trail of fire right as danger closes in. None of that works if your time machine is bolted to the floor of a garage. The writers needed something that could travel, something that could be driven into danger and driven back out of it, something with personality. That single realization changed the entire shape of the film, and it's why the version we all know feels so kinetic and alive instead of static and clinical. Enter the DeLorean. In real life, the DeLorean DMC-12 was already one of the strangest cars on the road, a stainless steel gull-winged oddity that had come and gone from production within just a couple of years, leaving behind a small but devoted following. It looked like nothing else in traffic. It looked, honestly, like it had already come from the future. Zemeckis and Gale saw that same quality and realized they didn't need to invent a time machine from scratch. They just needed to bolt some retro-futuristic gadgetry onto a car that already looked otherworldly. The flux capacitor, the glowing coils, the countdown to 88 miles per hour, all of it was designed to amplify a look the car already had. And because it was a car, the machine could become a character in its own right, something that could get damaged, get buried, get stolen, and get rescued right alongside the people driving it. It's hard to imagine now, but if the original stationary concept had stuck around, this movie might not have become the cultural landmark it is today. Now here's a detail that tends to surprise people. This movie almost never got made at all. When Zemeckis and Gale started shopping the script around Hollywood in the early 80s, they didn't get a warm reception. Studio after studio passed. Some executives thought the premise, a teenager traveling back in time and accidentally interfering with how his own parents fell in love, was simply too strange to sell to a mainstream audience. Others worried about tone. The script blended broad comedy with genuinely uncomfortable ideas, including the awkward reality that Marty's own mother develops a crush on him. Balancing comedy and real emotional stakes is a tightrope walk, and plenty of studios weren't convinced these two writers could pull it off. Reportedly, the project was turned down dozens of times before it found a home. That's not a small number of rejections for two guys who genuinely believed they had something special. What ultimately saved the project was persistence, plus the backing of one of the most powerful people in Hollywood at the time. Steven Spielberg, already a major force after the success of his own blockbusters, believed in the concept and put his name behind it as producer. That endorsement gave Universal Pictures the confidence to finally greenlight production. Without Spielberg's involvement, there's a real chance the script would have sat in a drawer somewhere, another interesting idea that never made it to a movie theater. It's a strange thing to think about, considering how deeply this film is now stitched into pop culture. The movie that ended up defining a decade almost never left the page. Casting turned out to be just as chaotic as getting the movie greenlit in the first place, and nowhere is that more obvious than with the role of Marty McFly. Michael J. Fox was the first choice for both Zemeckis and Gale from the very beginning. There was just one problem: Fox was already committed to a hit television sitcom, playing a conservative, fast-talking teenager on a weeknight comedy series. The producers of that show weren't willing to let him go, worried that losing their lead actor would hurt their ratings. So Fox had to turn the film down, at least for the time being. With their first choice unavailable, the filmmakers cast a different young actor in the role, and production actually got underway. For several weeks, an entirely different actor played Marty McFly on set, and real footage was shot with him in the role. But as filming continued, it became increasingly clear to Zemeckis and Gale that something wasn't clicking. The performance leaned dramatic and intense, when the character really needed a lighter touch, a sense of humor, a kind of bewildered charm as he stumbled through a decade he didn't belong in. It was a tough call, but eventually the filmmakers decided to make a change mid-production, something that almost never happens on a movie this size, because recasting a lead actor after weeks of filming is enormously expensive and disruptive. Around that same time, circumstances shifted on Fox's television show, and he suddenly became available. The filmmakers moved fast. Fox agreed to take on the role, but the arrangement that followed was brutal. For months, he was effectively working 2 full-time jobs at once. His television show filmed during the day, and Back to the Future filmed at night. He would finish one set, catch a couple of hours of sleep if he was lucky, then head straight to the other. Anyone who has pulled a single all-nighter for work knows how draining that is. Fox did something close to that night after night for the better part of a shooting schedule. And somehow, watching the final film, none of that exhaustion shows. His performance is sharp, funny, and full of energy, which honestly makes the achievement even more impressive when you know what was happening behind the scenes. To his credit, Fox has spoken about this chapter of his career with a surprising amount of grace. Rather than distancing himself from the actor he replaced, he's expressed genuine respect for the work that actor put into the role before the recasting happened. It's easy to imagine resentment building on either side of a situation like that, but by most accounts, both actors handled an unusually awkward professional situation with maturity. That casting shakeup didn't just affect Marty, it rippled out and touched other relationships on set too, including the dynamic between Fox and his co-star Leah Thompson, who played Lorraine, Marty's mother. Thompson had been cast from the very beginning, and she had spent real time building a working relationship with the actor who was originally playing Marty before the switch happened. When that actor was let go, it wasn't just a scheduling inconvenience for Thompson. It was the loss of someone she had bonded with professionally. Naturally, there was some tension when Fox arrived to take over the role. Part of that tension had to do with how the entertainment industry viewed television versus film at the time. In the early 80s, movie stardom and television stardom were treated as very different tiers of fame, and some film actors looked at TV actors as a notch below them, regardless of how talented or popular they were. Thompson has been candid in interviews about carrying some of that bias into her early scenes with Fox. She's admitted that she initially saw herself as coming from the film world and viewed Fox as coming from television, and that distinction created a bit of emotional distance between them at first. It wasn't hostility exactly, more like a cautious, cool politeness, while everyone adjusted to yet another disruption on an already chaotic production. That distance didn't last. As filming continued, especially through the movie's most memorable stretch of scenes, the uncomfortable, funny sequences where teenage Lorraine develops a crush on the son she doesn't know is her son, something shifted. Fox brought a kind of playful energy and comedic instinct that the material needed, and Thompson has said she came to recognize just how essential that lightness was to making those scenes work at all. Play it too serious, and those scenes become uncomfortable in the wrong way. Play it with warmth and humor, and they become some of the most beloved sequences in the entire film. Over time, professional respect turned into something closer to genuine partnership, and by the time the cameras stopped rolling, the early tension had faded into mutual appreciation. Thompson has since spoken openly about how her initial hesitation said more about industry assumptions at the time than it did about Fox himself. Marty wasn't the only role that almost went to someone else. Christopher Lloyd, the actor who would go on to define Doc Brown for generations of moviegoers, very nearly turned the part down without giving it much of a chance at all. At the time the script landed in front of him, Lloyd already had a respected career built on serious dramatic work, along with a beloved role on a popular sitcom playing an eccentric, unpredictable character. He wasn't hunting for his next project out of desperation. According to accounts from people who worked with him, Lloyd initially skimmed the Back to the Future script and wasn't immediately drawn in. Whether it was the strangeness of the time travel plot or just the wrong moment in his career, something about it didn't click on the first read, and by some tellings, he set it aside without giving it serious consideration. Somewhere along the way, though, he gave it a second look. Maybe someone close to him encouraged him to reconsider, or maybe he simply revisited it with a clearer head. Whatever changed his mind, Lloyd went back through the script and started to see what made it different from anything else being pitched around town at the time. A teenager gets flung 30 years into the past by a time machine built into a used sports car, and ends up having to make sure his own parents fall in love, or he'll cease to exist. It's an outrageous premise, but Lloyd began to see the potential underneath the strangeness. A big part of what pulled him in was the chance to work with Robert Zemeckis. Zemeckis wasn't yet the household name he'd become in the years that followed, but Lloyd could sense the ambition and imagination driving the project. He's talked about how much of an impression Zemeckis' enthusiasm made on him during their early conversations, and that connection ended up being the deciding factor. Once Lloyd signed on and filming began, it became obvious almost immediately that the film had found the right Doc Brown. He threw himself into the role completely, building a character who felt brilliant, slightly unhinged, and deeply warm all at once. The chemistry between Lloyd and Fox turned out to be instant, and that partnership became the emotional backbone of the entire trilogy. Imagining anyone else in that lab coat is nearly impossible today, and yet Lloyd came remarkably close to walking away before he ever got there. Now let's talk about Jennifer Parker, Marty's girlfriend in the film, because this is where one of the stranger casting stories comes in. Most fans remember Claudia Wells in the role, but she wasn't actually the first actress hired to play the part. Before the recasting shakeup that replaced Marty's original actor with Michael J. Fox, a different young actress had already been cast as Jennifer and had filmed scenes opposite the original Marty. Production was moving forward with that pairing, and everything seemed to be on track. Then came the decision to replace the lead actor with Fox, and that single change set off a chain reaction throughout the rest of the cast. The most commonly cited reason for recasting Jennifer had nothing to do with acting talent. It came down to something as simple and as frustratingly shallow as height. Fox stood noticeably shorter than the actress originally cast as Jennifer, and the filmmakers were concerned about how that height difference would read on screen in the film's romantic scenes. Rather than risk an awkward visual mismatch between the two leads, the decision was made to recast the role entirely. It wasn't a reflection of the actress's performance, it was simply a physical pairing issue that came up because of the earlier casting change. Claudia Wells, whose height matched up better with Fox, stepped into the role and ultimately became the Jennifer Parker audiences remember. Losing a role in a major film after production had already started could have been a serious setback for a young actress's career, but the actress originally cast went on to build a long and varied career of her own. She became widely recognized years later for playing a sharp, high-strung corporate executive on a hit workplace sitcom, and she also took on a recurring dramatic role as the late wife of the lead character in a popular detective series. Being let go from Back to the Future clearly didn't define the rest of her career, and by most accounts, she's looked back on the experience with more perspective than bitterness, treating it as one chapter in a much longer story rather than a defining setback. All of these behind-the-scenes stories, the recasting, the exhausting double shifts, the near misses on casting Doc Brown, add up to a production that was far messier than the final polished film ever let on. And maybe that's part of what makes Back to the Future so endearing decades later. It wasn't a smooth, effortless success from day one. It was built out of last-minute changes, difficult decisions, and a cast and crew who kept adjusting on the fly until everything finally clicked into place. That enduring appeal was on full display in January of 2025, when the surviving members of the main cast reunited at a fan convention in New Orleans to celebrate the film's 40th anniversary. Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, Leah Thompson, and Tom Wilson, who played the film's memorable villain, all appeared together for what was billed as one of the largest reunions the franchise had ever seen, alongside musician Huey Lewis, whose songs became inseparable from the movie's identity. Fans who attended got to hear the cast trade stories about those grueling shooting schedules, the recasting drama, and the strange alchemy that somehow turned a rocky production into a beloved classic. Watching the cast reflect on the film 4 decades later, it's clear that even they still marvel at how close the whole project came to falling apart before it ever got the chance to succeed. It's worth sitting with that thought for a second. A refrigerator instead of a DeLorean. No Spielberg to vouch for the script. No Michael J. Fox racing between 2 sets on no sleep. No Christopher Lloyd giving the script a second chance after almost tossing it aside. Change any one of those moments, and the movie we all grew up with might have turned out completely different or might not exist at all. Sometimes the difference between a forgotten screenplay and one of the most beloved films of a generation really does come down to a handful of decisions made under pressure, by people who weren't entirely sure it was going to work out. So the next time you watch that DeLorean hit 88 miles per hour, trailing fire behind it, remember that the whole idea almost started out inside a kitchen appliance, that the actor driving it almost wasn't in the movie at all, and that the mad scientist beside him almost said no before he ever said yes. It's a reminder that some of the most iconic moments in film history were held together by nothing more than persistence, a few lucky breaks, and people willing to change their minds at the last possible second. If you learned something new here, or if you already knew one of these stories and want to share it, drop a comment and let us know which detail surprised you the most. And if you're a fan of behind-the-scenes movie history like this, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories hiding behind your favorite films.